unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives,
a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. Here in the United States, we are approaching the end of a lengthy presidential campaign in which the issue of immigration has taken center stage. The Trump campaign has repeatedly attacked Joe Biden and Kamala Harris for failing to protect America's borders, with Trump's misleading claims that immigrants in Ohio are eating people's pets emerging as one of the most defining moments of the race so far. Harris, on the other hand, has gone on the offensive, blaming Trump for sabotaging a bipartisan Senate bill that would have beefed up border security. Amidst this back and forth, there's been relatively little attention paid to the changing composition of who exactly is trying to enter the United States without prior authorization. Since 2020, India has emerged as the country of origin for the largest number of migrants attempting to enter the United States outside of the Western Hemisphere. A new analysis by the Niskanen Center digs into what we know and what we don't about the surge from India. The authors of this new analysis, Gil Gera and Sneha Puri, are guests on the show this week. Gil is an immigration policy analyst at the Niskanen Center, where he focuses on immigration and foreign policy, migrant integration, and demographic trends at the U.S.-Mexico border. Sneha is an immigration policy fellow at the Niskanen Center, focusing on a wide range of immigration policy issues such as legal migration pathways, employment-based visas, and irregular migration. I'm pleased to welcome to the show for the very first time, Gil, Sneha, welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Well, I want to start with you at a really macro level before we get into this new analysis that the two of you have published on India. You've written in a separate piece and we're going to link to that in our show notes, about how immigration into the United States often happens in waves. So if you go back to the early 1990s and then fast forward till today, there have been 4 separate waves of immigration, the most recent of which really implicates irregular migrants from India. So walk us through, if you could, these 4 waves, and what are the distinguishing features of each?
Sure, and thank you again, Milan, for having us. We're very excited to be here. And I'll say for your audience at the outset, I'm referring here in these waves and in that piece to irregular migration. And I think we oftentimes in the U.S. use various terms for migration. Sometimes we refer to migrants as immigrants. Sometimes we refer to them as aliens. It can get confusing. So just to clarify for those who may not be familiar, irregular migration is essentially when migrants arrive and cross a border without prior authorization from the governing authorities of that territory. I think it sometimes gets conflated with illegal immigration, and illegal immigration is certainly a form of irregular migration, but presenting yourself for asylum, for example, is a legal form of irregular migration. So again, it's a bit more of a technical point, but that's really what I looked at in that piece. I became fascinated in this topic generally because I think in the US, we pay a lot of attention to top-line numbers. We pay a lot of attention to the overall numbers of migrants who are coming. We don't pay as much attention as to the composition of those migrants and how it impacts policy. So I really identify in the modern period, starting in the 1990s, really through 2010 or so, overwhelmingly, the migrants that were coming through the southern border on an irregular basis were Mexican nationals. They were mostly single Mexican men entering the U.S. for seasonal work, and that really changed and formed the way that we see irregular migration in the U.S. For many years, the archetype in the American imagination was essentially a Mexican migrant coming for economic reasons. This began to change around 2011 through the mid-2010s, when all of a sudden a lot more Central Americans began coming primarily from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, or the Northern Triangle countries, who were coming for reasons of both violence in those countries, environmental devastation. And that really changed how we saw policy and American politics domestically, because many times they were coming now in family units, and our immigration system was set up for single adults. And this led to crises in American domestic politics. If you think of family separation, other policies that, for example, the Biden-Harris administration has now adopted. If you think about Harris's portfolio that she was given it was entirely around root causes in the Northern Triangle countries, because at the time she assumed office in 2020, that really seemed to be where the next wave was forming. But following the pandemic, starting around 2022, we started seeing a far greater increase in growth from what immigration authorities refer to as historically atypical countries, or essentially countries outside of Mexico and Central America that were coming. And many of these had a very distinct political component. There were increasing numbers of migrants from Venezuela due to the political crisis there, as well as Nicaragua and Cuba, as well as Haiti, which had essentially all these countries had in some form some kind of major political collapse. So again, that shifted how we approach migration. But now the fourth wave, which is what Sehanai's piece is about, which I'm very interested in, is that in recent years, there's been a very significant increase in migrants who are coming from outside of the hemisphere. Some of them are coming from Africa, but increasingly, many of them are coming from what we would consider middle-income countries like India and China, who are increasingly coming not only through the southern border, but through the northern border. And that, for me, is where a lot of the most interesting change is happening now.
So, Gil, I just want to kind of step back for a second and ask you kind of another just kind of definitional question, right? Like, it seems like today in our political and our news discourse, we hear a lot about encounters at the border, right? There are this surge in encounters, right? This came up during the presidential debate, came up during the vice presidential debate. When people talk about encounters at the border, what are they referring to? What is the connection between that and irregular migration?
Sure. That is essentially any time that a member of U.S. immigration authorities comes into contact with migrants who, again, has no legal basis to be in the United States. Sometimes numbers can be obscured because there can be repeat encounters, for example. I think this is oftentimes the case with migrants, again, from Mexico and Central America. Oftentimes, if they cross and get sent back right away, they may try to cross again. That varies a lot by nationality. For migration from outside the hemisphere, for example, such as China and India, we imagine the numbers to be much lower because once you get sent back, it's obviously much harder to try to cross again because you're presumably either detained or you've actually been sent back to your country of origin.
But this includes, for instance, people who are seeking asylum in the United States. They may show up at the border. They have no paperwork. They have no documentation. They have a claim about, say, being persecuted in their home countries, but that would be classified as an encounter at the border. Okay. Sneha, let me just now turn to the topic at hand, which is really this surge in irregular migration coming from India. One of the things that you and Gil document in your new piece, drawing on government data, is that since October 2020, U.S. Customs and Border Protection has encountered nearly 170,000 Indian migrants at both the southern and the northern U.S. land borders. I think, I want to get into some of the demographic and characteristics of these Indians. But before we do that, place these numbers in perspective, right? So what share of overall irregular migrants does this account for? Where does India kind of rank in terms of country of origin?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And the northern and the southern borders really tell a very different stories. So since October 2020, there have been almost 86,000 encounters with Indian nationals in the southwest border, which puts India in about the 15th place, but still the most for an extra hemispheric country, above China at about 64,000 people, but still significantly lesser than some countries in Central and South America. So, for example, there were 3 million people coming from Mexico and between 500,000 to 1 million from Guatemala, Honduras, Venezuela, Cuba each. So in the northern border, the story is very different. Indian nationals make up the largest proportion of migrants coming irregularly from the northern border after Canadian migrants since October 2020. But in fact, in fiscal year 2024, there have actually been more Indian nationals than Canadian nationals migrating irregularly from the northern border. And there have been no really indications or trends that this is going to go downwards, at least in the foreseeable few months. There are no Central or South American countries that even come close to being over 1,000 per year, except Mexico, which averages at about 5,000 to 10,000 per year. So to summarize, compared to the southwest border, Indian nationals make up a much bigger proportion of encounters with irregular migrants at the northern border. And more generally, figures from the CBP, which is the Customs and Border Protection, show that the number of undocumented Indian migrants or irregular Indian migrants increased the fastest among all nationals between 2020 and 2023.
So we're seeing this big surge in people coming from, of course, outside the Western Hemisphere, by definition, if they're coming from India. I want to get into a little bit about kind of who these migrants are, right? What do we know about where they are coming from in India? And why might they be trying to enter the United States without going through the standard immigration process, right? We know, for instance, that in some ways, Indian Americans are the poster children for the legal immigration regime in the United States, right? They benefited enormously from, say, things like the H-1B visa. So much of that immigration has been new in the post kind of 2000, post-IT boom. But we're talking about a different set of people coming through different channels. Tell us a little bit about where they're coming from and why this surge might be happening at this particular moment in time.
Absolutely. So we don't have any sort of direct database to sort of refer to know exactly where these migrants are coming from, but there are a wide range of sources that Gil and I have used to sort of like understand or get an estimate on where they're coming from. So, for example, we used immigration data or immigration proceedings to know and to learn that the top 3 languages spoken by Indian migrants, aside from English, among the new proceedings in immigration court are Punjabi at about 80,000 since 2012, Hindi at about 40,000, and Gujarati at about 18,500 since 2012. And this is in line with a lot of reporting and a lot of anecdotal evidence that we have that a lot of these irregular migrants are coming from the northern states of Punjab and Haryana. And just to add on to that, we don't have, there's no readily available religious demographic data, but many Punjabi speakers are likely to be Sikhs. And these immigrants are typically from middle-class families. They can sell their land to pay for their journey, hoping that they get better economic opportunities in America, which brings me to the reason for their migration. So the different reasons can sort of fall into 2 buckets, which is political reasons and economic reasons. And I'm sure Gil will go into the political reasons more later, but to speak specifically about the economic motivation to move to the United States, they're mainly, it starts off with the fact that there is a lack of sufficient economic opportunities among young people in some parts of northern India. And there is a rising, or at least a very high unemployment rate, especially in Punjab, which is significantly higher than the national average, which gives young people in Punjab the sense that they are not able to provide for their families and they need to move to the United States to provide for better economic opportunities. And this is in line with the fact that there are a lot of communities that are Indian, especially from northern India, who are in the United States, who can then support these people who are coming from India and migrating irregularly. The second facet of this is that there was a series of laws in India which I'm sure you have discussed on the show previously about the deregulation of India's agricultural sector in 2020, which did threaten to disrupt the lives of many farmers, many of whom are from the northern states of Haryana and Punjab. And this led to massive protests in the country, which and even though these bills were eventually repealed in 2021, there is still a level of destabilization and a level of uncertainty among the farmers about being able to provide for their families or being able to have the same economic opportunities in India as they potentially could in the United States, especially based on what they have heard from the Indian diaspora, who again have a very big community in the United States. So it's a mix of these two that really form the basis of the economic motivation to migrate to the United States through irregular channels. Now, why they are not seeking to take legitimate paths or to get a visa to the United States is primarily that, first of all, there is an over 1 year wait for a tourist visa to the United States, just to get an appointment for a tourist visa at most Indian consulates, which is definitely a long time compared to, getting a tourist visa in Canada. The average processing time for which is 76 days on average. And we'll get into more of that when we talk about the northern border. But this is to say that for a lot of families, or especially a lot of people in northern India, coming through this irregular channel is just seems easier. And just to add on to all of that, there's also a looming drug crisis in Punjab and in a lot of northern states, which just adds on to that fear of unemployment and lack of economic opportunity, which all of them contributes to the reason for migration.
But I think I just want to kind of go back to something you said, which is that the folks who are coming from India through an unauthorized route, who may be seeking asylum, or they may just be, undocumented, just trying to come in illegally. These are people who are not necessarily coming from the poorest sections of society, right? I mean, in order to make this trip in the first place, you've got to have some resources, right? So these are people who you would describe as coming from, say, the middle classes, the middle sections of India?
Yes, absolutely. That's that's spot on. That's exactly how I would describe them. And to add on to that, if you come to the US, passing through sometimes several countries, it takes a lot of money, which unfortunately, the people who are in the lowest economic strata in India just don't have access to those kind of resources that, for example, they can sell their land to get that money, or they can mortgage their property. It can take up to $100,000 to do this whole journey. And so you're right. These are people who are middle class, but possibly even, having some level of English proficiency, at least enough that they are able to understand that where to get access to the agents who are going to help them through this whole process. And, again, going back to having the resources to be able to pay for this journey, which is definitely not cheap.
I mean, if you're paying up to $100,000 US, you're actually well beyond the middle class in India to be able to afford that, right? Because this is something that's actually an exorbitant amount to spend. Let me just kind of ask you one follow-up just on the region of origin question, right? I think many of our listeners might intuitively understand why irregular migration is up from Punjab, right? There's a political situation. You mentioned the farm protests. This is at a time when there's quite a lot of tension between the Sikh community and the Hindu community. There's also the economic dimension. The Punjab it's really stagnated, right? It has not been able to industrialize. It's still reliant on the farm economy and so on and so forth. Gujarat is a bit more puzzling, right? Because this has been historically one of the most prosperous states. Famously, it is the state of Narendra Modi, the prime minister. When he was the chief minister of Gujarat, it was the fastest growing state if you look at GDP growth rates. What insight do we have into why irregular migration from Gujarat might be on the rise? Is this just a question of kind of social connectivity that, there are a lot of Gujaratis in the United States. They may be, trying to get their friends and family over. How do we think about that particular nexus?
Yes, you're right. The anecdotal evidence suggests that it is primarily because of social networks in the United States. And to give you an example, there is evidence that approximately or almost half of all the motels in the United States are owned by Gujaratis. And this is really a very huge percentage that, when you think about it. And it comes back to the fact that if you are in Gujarat and you are struggling to find the economic opportunities that you really want to be able to provide for your family, and you have a community in Gujarat who will, not only be able to provide you with economic opportunities if they are entrepreneurs, but also possibly even providing you with a social network, possibly providing you with, immediate assistance that you might need, whether it's like housing or whether it's, any financial support that you might need initially when you first migrate to the United States. So it's the social network or the social safety net that you have in the US that, you can come here and you will be taken care of is something that is a big factor that comes into this. And I think the other sort of reason for that is for a lot of people in India, in Gujarat, or the rest of India, if you have to wait for over a year just to get an appointment for a tourist visa. Not only that, on top of that, if you are someone who perhaps cannot get a job in the United States while you are in India, or perhaps you cannot, get into a university and come through the F1 visa route, you really don't have any other options. And then if you are in that situation where you really want to come to the US and you don't have all of these pathways available to you, but what you do have is a very strong community in the United States who is going to take care of you once you come here, giving you job opportunities because they are entrepreneurs. I think that really plays a factor into why we see Gujaratis also taking this route of coming to the United States irregularly.
So, Gil, I want to come to you in a second, but Sneha, just one final question on this point, which is what you and Gil have done in this note is to assemble to the best extent possible different fragments of data on the demographic characteristics of irregular Indian migrants. What does this kind of limited snapshot tell us about who they are, right? I mean, what do we know about their gender? Are they coming by themselves? Are they coming with families? Like beyond region of origin, do we have any sense of kind of, who these people are?
So I think you described the data very accurately. It's definitely a fragment. It's like fragments of data of these personal characteristics. But I do think that they tell a very good estimate of the type of people who are coming to the United States from India through irregular channels. So in our report, we use sort of three sources of information or, three databases to really get this picture of who is coming from India, and specifically the demographical information. So first and foremost, of the countries that irregular Indian migrants pass through on their way to the United States, Honduras is the one that captures detailed data about the age and gender. Now, it is very important to note that this is a very small sample, and it's definitely not going to be representative of all the Indian migrants or, the entire population of Indian migrants who are coming irregularly, but it does give a sense of at least some estimation or some idea of who is coming. So 95% of irregular Indian migrants encountered in Honduras were men, and 76% of them were adults, 24% were minors, and while females are definitely underrepresented in this group, about 80% were adults. And what we also found that 55% were between the ages of 21 and 30, which again is in line with the data that we found on the immigration court proceedings using the Transactional Recordings Access Clearinghouse. And we found that since all the new proceedings in 2024 among Indian nationals, 72% of them were for the ages of 18 to 34. And again, this is in line with all the evidence that suggests that these people are younger and predominantly male. Now, using the encounter data, we can get a better sense of whether they're coming as individuals in a family unit. That is to say, are they coming as a family or they're coming as single adults? So the encounter data suggests that since October 2020, single adults have made up about 80 to 81% of all encounters with Indian nationals across both borders. Initially, in fiscal year 2021 and 2022, there were notable differences between the southern and the northern border. So, for example, in 2021, 52% of Indian nationals encountered at the southwest border were single adults and 40% were family unit. So, which means there were kind of a similar number of people who were coming as a family and who were coming as single adults. But 92% of encounters at the northern border were with single adults and only 6% for family unit, which is to say that in that year, most people from the northern border were coming as single adults. However, this gap has significantly narrowed since then. And in 2023 and 2024 until now, over 80% of encounters at both borders were with single adults. As of now, those two numbers have really sort of this gap has really narrowed in recent years, and only about 20% of individuals are coming as a family unit. And that is to say they're coming like as a family. So that's just an overview of the data that we have on the type of people or the type of Indian migrants who are coming irregularly in the United States.
Are you curious about India's economy, politics, culture, and history, and hungry for rigorous analysis of its most pressing challenges? Tune in to Ideas of India, the podcast that's becoming the go-to source for smart thinking on Indian political economy. Hosted by Shruti Rajagopalan, Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. You can hear from top experts in economics, law, and social sciences such as Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Anne Kruger, Arvind Panagriya, and many others. Explore cutting-edge ideas shaping India's political economy from young academic scholars, and connect with a community of forward-thinking intellectuals. Ideas of India offers invaluable insights for anyone invested in India's progress. Subscribe now to Ideas of India and be part of the conversations driving India's future. New episodes are released every 2 weeks and are available on all major podcasting platforms. Transcripts of each conversation are also available at mercatus.org/Ideas of India. I mean, I would just say that, if you just focus on the age profile of who these people are, it kind of lends credence to the economic explanation, right? I mean, these are people who are perhaps looking for opportunities, not finding them. And that also maybe helps to explain the Gujarat story as well, where it's a much more prosperous state, but we know that a lot of the growth with Gujarat's experience has also been jobless, right? In the sense that despite economic dynamism, there's still a fair number of people who are not necessarily unemployed, but certainly underemployed from what we can tell from the Indian data. Gil, let me just turn to you now and ask you about the region and areas of entry, because Sneha mentioned something in the setup, which I think a lot of our listeners are not going to be aware of, right? Which is there has been a real shift from the southern route coming up from Mexico to the northern route. If you go and read media reports, right, a lot of it focuses on irregular Indian migration coming through the Americas, first through places like El Salvador, Nicaragua, and then eventually through Mexico. You write that this is changing. Tell us a little bit about what might be happening to shift the surge from the south to the north.
Great question. And for me, India is a really fascinating case study because we can directly see how actions taken by different regional governments vis-a-vis Indian nationals have actually impacted the routes they take over time. And one of the important things to understand here at the outset is that one of the main obstacles in migrating through the Americas, through South America, through Central America to North America, is a piece of land called the Darien Gap in Panama, which is incredibly difficult to traverse. It is mostly essentially ungoverned in some patches. It is oftentimes very dangerous, very arduous to get through, expensive to get through. So for many migrants, especially those coming outside of the hemisphere, there's a very big premium on avoiding the Darien Gap because of all of those obstacles. And for Indians, this hadn't been much of a problem for the purposes of irregular migration for most of the time period that Sneha and I have studied. India in 2019 had visa-free travel to some countries in the Western Hemisphere, namely Ecuador and El Salvador. Ecuador, though, is in South America, so even then when Ecuador rescinded visa-free travel for Indian nationals, we didn't see much that's really happened there because, again, most of the ones who are already, as Sneha mentioned, are paying an exorbitant amount of money to get to the U.S. via this channel, would rather avoid the Darien Gap altogether. But then the Salvadoran government rescinded its visa-free travel, and on top of that, also added a fee of over $1,000 to travelers from India and also from Africa who were coming through El Salvador. And that made it, again, much more difficult for Indians to take this route. A number of other countries have also taken actions against Indian nationals. Panama has, as recently as September, deported over 200 Indian migrants from the Darien Gap that were encountered there. Brazil has seen a big uptick in Indian nationals who are arriving in Brazil and then claiming asylum in the Brazilian airports as a way of staying there and then later making their way via land to the United States. So all of these factors contribute to this very large shift that we begin seeing in 2023 towards the northern border.
I mean, Gil, these are pretty hefty fines, right? I mean, if you are an Indian who wants to go to Salvador, this is an across-the-board fine. So, like, say you're visiting family or visiting friends. I mean, you are going to pay upwards of $1,000 just to gain visa entry to this country?
That is correct, yes. And again, that was made to deter irregular Indian migration, but obviously is going to have an impact on regular Indian tourism as well.
So, Snehan, let me just kind of switch to the northern border, because one of the things you said earlier was there has been this sharp increase in encounters on the Canadian border, right? We're seeing significantly higher numbers of encounters on the northern border now than we are at the southern border. So, Gil mentioned, some of the push factors, right? That some of this visa-free travel, increased expenditure, so on and so forth, may have pushed people away. Are there other factors happening on the northern side that are leading people to kind of, move in this direction?
Yeah, for sure. So, first and foremost, as I mentioned earlier, there is a significantly lesser processing time for a Canadian visitor visa in India compared to, a tourist visa for the United States. So, like the average processing time is 76 days. And as you can imagine, you can pay this and you can enter Canada on a legal basis and then sort of make your way to the United States. And physically and just in terms of logistics, that is just a less arduous journey than, coming from the southern border and potentially crossing over multiple countries. And the perception is that the southern border is less safe, more physically arduous, and just generally, it is, less, it's like, more guarded, and the US-Canada border is also longer than the US-Mexico border. And while it is not necessarily safer, and I will give some examples later, criminal groups generally do not have the same presence in the US-Canada border as they do along the route through South and Central America. So that is not to say that the US-Canada border is, extremely safe and, you can just like sort of easily make your way through. Unfortunately, there have been incidences of families sort of freezing to death, as was one case in 2022, where a family of 4 from Gujarat froze to death 13 yards away from the Canadian border because they were separated from the rest of their group during a blizzard. And there was another family of 4 last year in mid-2023 that, also passed away on their journey to the United States. So it is a difficult journey that does involve trekking, often for many hours, and spending nights in freezing temperatures. However, it's about the public perception, which is that it is a less difficult journey and a less dangerous journey than coming from the southern border. So I would say it's a mixture of logistics and just sort of how difficult it is physically that is leading more people towards coming from the northern border, along with the fact that they do have a way to get legally into Canada through that tourist visa and then coming into the United States, which just reduces the number of countries you have to pass through and the number of borders that you have to pass through before you reach your ultimate country or ultimate destination, which is India.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of all makes sense when you look at a map, right? I mean, but one thing that I learned from your piece that I did not know is obviously that Canadian-American border is very long, right? It stretches the breadth of our country. But there is something called the Swanton sector where we've seen this surge. Tell us, what is the Swanton sector? Where are we seeing this big increase?
Yeah, so the Swanton sector is an area in Vermont. And it covers a large, most of that state. And we are seeing that increasingly most of the irregular Indian migrants who are encountered or who are, encountered by CBP officers are coming from the Swanton sector or are encountered in the Swanton sector. And that sector is in the US-Canada border. And that is just giving us more evidence that suggests that Indian migrants are coming from the US-Canada border. Now, as Gil mentioned earlier on, I do want to preface this by saying that just because there are more encounters in the Swanton sector does not directly mean that these are migrants who are coming from the US-Canada border, because they could be encountered anywhere in that sector. And more importantly, there could be potentially people who are, double counted, potentially people who are not even encountered. So encounter data is not, directly linked to the exact number of people who are coming from the US-Canada border or coming through that sector. But I it is likely that most of those encounters are people who are coming from the US-Canada border into Vermont.
Right. And if I could just add something to that also, as far as why it's happening specifically in that sector as opposed to other sectors of the Canadian border, which, as you mentioned, is vast. One of the other things that Sneha and I did in our piece is that using zip code data from court cases among Indian nationals, we created 3 maps that mapped out where Hindi speakers, where Punjabi speakers, and where Gujarati speakers were settling after being in the US for 1 to 2 years. And one of the things that we found, again, most of the migrants who are coming are either Hindi or Punjabi speakers, is that many of them are settling in New York or on the New York City metropolitan area generally. And so, again, if you think about it just geographically, if you're coming through the southern border and one of your destinations or a common destination for these migrants is New York City, that's a much longer trip you have to make. Whereas if you cross through the Swanton sector, which also includes areas of, say, New York, as well as the state of Vermont, there's a much shorter journey that you have to make to reach your final destination. And I think that also makes that particular sector appealing.
So, Gil, I just want to talk a little bit about this disaggregation you've done by language spoken, right? As you mentioned, since 2021, the top 3 languages spoken by irregular Indian migrants, other than English, is Punjabi, Hindi, Gujarati. I think Punjabi accounts for the lion's share. But interestingly, when it comes to the outcomes of asylum court decisions, which is also data you've collected, Punjabis appear to have a significantly higher success rate in successfully claiming asylum than Gujaratis, for instance. So it's, I think, 73% of Punjabis in your data successfully claim asylum compared to just 53% for Gujaratis. Do we have any sense of what accounts for that disparity?
Right. I think it really comes down to how the asylum system in the United States works, which I think there's sometimes a misconception about what you need to claim asylum. Oftentimes people think that all that you need to have is some sort of credible threat against your safety. That means that you can't be removed. But really, the asylum system is for people who are being persecuted for a particular characteristic. It can be their gender. It can be some sort of social activity they participated in. It can be a political identity. It can be an ethnicity. It can be a religion. You essentially need to have some sort of persecution based along those lines instead of just a generalized sense. For example, if you're coming from Central America, that a gang that is local to your area is going to kill you. That is not enough to qualify for asylum in the United States. You have to have that specific persecution that is based off of those shared characteristics. And I think that we looked at other potential factors that could sway asylum. So essentially, there are 2 forms of asylum. One is affirmative asylum, where you present yourself to the immigration authorities to claim asylum outright. And there's defensive asylum, when you are under threat of deportation, but you claim asylum as a way of staving off that deportation because it would be dangerous for you to return to your home country. Defensive asylum has about a 33% success rate. Affirmative asylum has about a 58% success rate. But what was interesting to me was that the overall percentages of defensive and affirmative asylum really varied very, very little between Punjabi, Hindi, and Gujarati speakers, which does indicate that there is something about Punjabi speakers that is allowing them to get higher levels of asylum. And we essentially managed to isolate, considering other factors, that it likely is something to do either with a religious claim of persecution, a political claim of persecution, that the United States, which, unlike many of your listeners, I think has oftentimes, especially I think if you think of the average asylum case officer, a very poor understanding of Indian political dynamics. I think the narrative that there is persecution happening in Punjab on a religious level, on an ethnic level, seems more credible than, say, the claim that persecution is happening on those characteristics in Gujarat.
So this is very interesting and is a nice segue to the next thing I wanted to ask you, Gil, which is, we have seen in recent months these very explosive allegations involving Indian government officials who may have conspired to target and kill Sikh separatists in North America, one particular case in Canada, one in the United States. I think these have been well covered and documented and reported on. Obviously, when you now throw this question of potentially illegal migration into the mix, right, this has the potential to become a very hot button political issue. I guess my question for you is, to what extent is this irregular migration, especially given the shift to the northern border, to what extent has that become a pressing policy issue for these three countries, right? Canada, India, and the United States. Do we have any sense that this is now on the policy agenda, in the policy bloodstream discourse in a way that it hasn't been previously?
Right. This was one of the motivating questions for me in writing this article and trying to explain this, because it was something that going into it, I also didn't understand. And I'll say at the outset also that I'm not an expert, certainly in Indian geopolitics, but I will shamelessly cite and quote people who are. And one of the books that I found useful when I was researching this piece, Aparna Pandey has a book written in 2017 called From Chanakya to Modi, The Evolution of India's Foreign Policy, that actually has a subsection of how India views its diaspora in terms of its foreign policy. India has the most sizable diaspora in the world. One of the estimates most recently is that it is certainly over 18 million people who are living abroad with Indian passports. But the way that India views its diaspora has overwhelmingly been that this is a good thing for India. I think sometimes countries struggle with questions of brain drain, whether they want to encourage people to stay or to go. But really, since the founding of India, many of the statements made, for example, by early leaders such as Nehru, is that Indians who go abroad and are successful are a romance, in his words. It's something that India can be proud of. It's sort of this compelling story. And also, as you mentioned earlier in your comments, that Indians sort of serve as this ambassadorial role of good legal migration, white collar workers, oftentimes in Western countries. There's also an economic component here. In 2023, India received a total of $120 billion in remittances, which is about 3.4% of India's GDP. So clearly, from the outset, it seems that Indian heads of states, Indian policymakers, have viewed the diaspora as being something that is good, and oftentimes also made statements about not really having too much of a political interest in the diaspora, but having more of an economic and cultural interest. I think that aspect has changed, certainly recently. I know that on this podcast, you had Dr. Jaishankar on recently, and he also talked about the diaspora a little bit, and he mentioned all of the things that I just mentioned as far as benefits, but he also mentions, for example, hate crimes that have happened here in the United States towards the Indian community, and the need to have some sort of outlets to remedy that. And I think part of what he was alluding to, which was these Hindu temples being desecrated in New York and Sacramento, touches on the question of the Sikh diaspora and support for Khalistan. And I know that you had another episode about this on your podcast with Sanjay Ruparela, so I'll direct certainly your listeners to that. But to be very brief, if they're not familiar with it, the Khalistan movement is essentially a separatist movement seeking an independent homeland for the Sikhs. And one of the books that I found useful in understanding why Canada plays such a big role in this is Terry Miluski's book, Blood for Blood, which details Sikh separatism in Canada specifically, because many of the immigrants who fled Punjab during the insurgent period, where tens of thousands of people were killed, wound up settling in Canada. And support for the Khalistan movement, while generally being very low, did have stronger support in the diaspora. And again, even though it has low support, even though the overall numbers of their supporters are small, it is still responsible for some of the most dramatic incidents in Indian security in modern age. You can think of the assassination of Indira Gandhi by people who were Sikh nationalists. You can think of the bombing of Air India Flight 182, for example, which was the worst terrorist attack in Canadian history that happened. So again, India has increasingly also kind of a securitized view of its diaspora in that sense. And so it seems to me, when I was first writing this article, you have more and more migrants who are presumably Sikh crossing through Canada, which is a country that India has had poor relations with over this question of the Sikh diaspora, who are then coming to the United States and being granted asylum at higher rates, which means that tacitly, again, on some level, it seems, even if it's a very unofficial, very low-level one, that would indicate that the United States government is acknowledging that there is persecution against Punjabis or Sikhs which could be upsetting to the Indian government in my eyes. So I think that there are a lot of reasons why, despite that making sense, it actually hasn't occurred. Certainly not on a public official level, but even in anecdotal reporting. And I think one of it is that there's a big difference between the Indian diaspora in Canada versus the United States. On a per capita basis, you could argue that Canada is actually the most Sikh country in the world. The Sikhs are 2.1% of the population. If you look at the specific numbers and religious demographics of the Indian diaspora, which again, I've read your report on the Indian diaspora that you've rewritten, so I feel almost embarrassed quoting these numbers at you. But the most recent estimate in the United States that was made by Pew, the diaspora is 48% Hindu and 8% Sikh. From the Canadian census, as far as we're able to cobble together, the diaspora is 44.55% Hindu and 41.5% Sikh. So it seems that there is a much bigger voter base there in Canada that could potentially influence Canadian policy in a way that, again, here in the US, not that 8% is nothing when it comes to diaspora, but it's simply much, much smaller. And I think that, again, India's historical inclination to view its diaspora as successful, their attempts to push the United States to offer more H-1B visas, more high-skilled visas, the prestige they get generally from the diaspora, and the economic benefit they get from remittances, all leads to it not being as much of an issue, I think, for Indian policymakers. And I think also anecdotally from the reporting that we've read and the people that we've talked to, there seems to be an understanding that many of the claims of persecution that are being made by Sikh or Punjabi migrants once they get here are in some ways obscuring the real motivation of why they're coming, which tends to be economic, which tends to be unrelated, say, to being active in the Khalistan movement. So for me, that answers that piece of the puzzle.
Sneha, I just want to invite you, if you have anything else, do you want to add to this before we move on to the next question I wanted to ask Gil was about kind of China, India, but I don't know if you want to say anything about this question of kind of the India, Canada, US nexus before we move on.
I think Gil gives a very good overview of most of what we wanted to say in the article. I would want to add, though, about your point about this Indian migrant being this ideal immigrant in the United States and historically contributing a lot to the economy in the United States. And it is to be seen how these new migrants who are coming through irregular channels are going to assimilate in the United States, and how existing migrants in the United States are going to react, are going to treat, and possibly have opinions about migrants coming through irregular channels who are different when it comes to the economic strata, who are different possibly when it comes to, their education levels, their English proficiency levels, and their skills, just in terms of, comparing them to the existing diaspora, Indian diaspora in the US, which tends to be high skilled. That is something that, we should be looking out for, and we really should be analyzing as, these numbers grow, or, as these people assimilate, as we get to know more about their economic outcomes, as we get to know more about how they are integrating in the US economy, about the current Indian diaspora and how they react and interact with the new migrants who are coming through irregular channels.
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. I mean, I would just say, I think it's an excellent point, and we have evidence, anecdotal and some evidence from political science, suggesting that Latino and Asian communities experience this tension, bifurcation, right, between people who came quote unquote legally and people who came quote unquote illegally, and that actually can shape people's political views. It can shape their views on immigration, a whole range of things, right, that matter, in American democracy. Gil, I just want to, this is a bit of a tangent, but I think for our listeners might be interesting, which is that in one of the pieces you wrote, you talk about how irregular migration from India shares many of the same features as irregular migration from China, which to my mind then kind of raise two questions, right? The first is, how do they compare in terms of magnitude, right? In terms of irregular migration from China vis-a-vis India? And number two, what is it that these migration patterns have in common, and where do they differ?
Right. Again, excellent question. And again, for me, one of the most fascinating case studies that can be made right now when looking at irregular migration, because these are really the only two countries that are large enough and I think have wealthy enough populations to be sending people to the United States through these channels. And, as far as magnitude goes, and Sneha touched upon this earlier, India has been the largest country of origin for extra-hemispheric irregular migration. They, so far, since last October, make up 63,025 encounters at both borders, whereas the Chinese are growing rapidly but are still overall lower with only 48,361 encounters. That being said, China has now eclipsed India and has for several months at the southern border, whereas many of the Indian encounters, as Neha mentioned, are now happening at the northern border. Although based on last month's data, we're actually seeing a shift in Chinese migration also to the northern border, which is why I think in many ways this migration shares many characteristics. Obviously, some of it has to do demographically. I think they have large populations of young people who may see themselves as having better economic futures in the United States and their home countries, who have enough resources essentially to make this journey. One of the most interesting factors for me is how social media plays a potential role in this also, because I think that it is linked to the ways in which people are motivated to migrate and how they migrate. If you think about the way that people typically have migrated to the United States, you know someone who's already there from an ethnic community, from a religious community. You might have a family member who's already there. You might have a neighbor or a family friend who's already there. And so in order to migrate successfully, or to make it at least easier to migrate, you very much benefited from having those connections because someone could walk you through the process. And you also got a sense of what life in that country would be like. And I think if you look at how technology has advanced over time, and social media technology in particular has advanced over time, we started out with things that were very much text-based. It was MySpace and it was Facebook, where you basically just saw, for the most part, texts. And then it shifted to Snapchat and Instagram. And now all of a sudden you could see images of people who you view as your equals and your peers living life in the United States in a very glamorized way. But that still didn't really tell you much either about their daily lives or how to migrate there. And as I'm sure you know now, the shift has entirely gone to video, and specifically short form video, whether it's TikTok, whether it is Instagram Reels or YouTube Shorts. Everything is now very much short video, which really allows you to see, one, what is life in this country like, even if you're thousands of miles away. Obviously, everyone posts glamorized versions of it, but also, two, how do you actually make these journeys? And that's especially the case for Chinese migrants, I think, where you no longer need to have this personal connection. You obviously do still need to pay a lot of money to have people help you along the way, but you can see step by step, if you follow the right channels and the right hashtags, how to get, say, from China to Ecuador, from Ecuador to the Darien Gap, from the Darien Gap through Mexico, and people are constantly uploading videos in real time, basically demonstrating how to do that. And so I think both on the inspirational aspect of immigration, but also on the actual technical aspect of immigration, I think both India and China have a large share of young people who have grown up as digital natives, who are very much both influenced by that technology and are able to actually harness it for their own purposes. That being said, there are some differences. Sneha mentioned that 55% of Indian migrants in the Honduran data were from 21 to 30. China's population in that same database is slightly older. They have 43%, or a plurality, or 31 to 40. And it seems to me that many of the Chinese migrants who are coming, while they are also still mostly male, tend to be people who were small business owners in China or who had some other operation in China, who had their businesses really impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and who are essentially, in many cases, coming to the United States to start a new life that is separate from China. There is more of a political angle there as far as not having confidence in the future of China. Whereas in many of the anecdotal reporting that Sneha and I read in writing this piece, it seems very much that many of the migrants coming from Punjab and Haryana are coming to work in the United States and send remittances back home. It's less to start this new life in the United States fully, and it's more about essentially making sure that your family has a future. Which again, if you think of the background that we mentioned of these families, if you're a farmer and you have a son who perhaps doesn't have the skills or the interest in running the farm, it makes more sense to sell off a parcel of that land, have the son go to the United States, earn American dollars, and then send money back. That's also just, in some ways, a wise financial decision. And the last point that I'll make, which again also talks to the previous question you asked about why this hasn't been an issue, it seems to me that Chinese irregular migration has been heavily securitized. Much of the discourse around Chinese migrants coming through the border tends to be around the potential national security risks that are posed by that migration, about how they could be potential saboteurs or spies. And that really has created, I think, a big incentive for China to also tamp down on this migration, or at least to, while not explicitly acknowledging it, I think they oftentimes actually become over time embarrassed by the migration also in the context of US-China competition. And it's just another point between the US and China that is another disagreement that they don't need. So they have, I think, in that sense, taken a harder tack. Whereas, again, if you compare how India tends to view its diaspora, as we mentioned previously, it seems that while certainly I'm sure there's some cooperation going on, there's also not this feeling that Indian migrants are being perceived as spies in the US, or that it's necessarily harming the overall US-India relationship.
I mean, when I woke up this morning, I did not think that I was going to be talking about MySpace. Gil and Sneha, you look too young to even ever have been on MySpace, but thank you for that trip down memory lane. I thought what you had to say about the kind of short form video and that being used as a way of kind of glamorizing or incentivizing people to think that life is a certain way here is quite compelling. I want to maybe bring this conversation to an end by asking you about the sort of policy solution side, right? I mean, Gil, in something you've written, you've noted that U.S. immigration policy has placed an outsized focus on short-term reactive solutions as opposed to being focused on kind of concrete, well-thought-out, well-developed policies. We're rapidly approaching Election Day. Immigration is a top-tier issue this election. A lot of the debate thus far has focused on the question of, or the fate, I guess I should say, of this bipartisan Senate immigration bill. It fell out of favor with the Republicans once Donald Trump came out against it. Sneha, Gil, this is a question for both of you. Does this bill, answer your call for concrete, well thought out policies? Are there other changes you'd like the U.S. government to consider, right? What do we think are the implications for policymakers of this really excellent and interesting analysis that you've put together?
Sure, and I can start. And one of the general analyses of immigration politics in the U.S. that I've always found the most compelling comes from Ramesh Ponnuru at the National Review, who essentially breaks it down by saying that Republicans have always emphasized border security, whereas Democrats have emphasized legalization. And the real tension is that neither side trusts the other. So Republican proposals tend to be about, we need to have border security first, and then later we can talk about legalization. And Democratic proposals tend to be the opposite, where they want to legalize first, and then eventually at some point down the line, we'll get to border security. And I think that eventually one side has to bite the bullet. And so even though at the Niskanen Center, we are typically in line more with the immigration advocates community inside of politics, we came out and endorsed that bill when it was proposed in February and very much believe in it as a pathway forward, because it seems clear to us that at this point, that is very much what the public wants. I think oftentimes whenever I tell people I work in immigration policy, I hear people kind of jokingly, allude to just how polarized it is, how nothing can ever get done, no one ever agrees in it, right? But I think that it is very clear at this point that it is polarized at the public elite level, but it's really not polarized at the popular level. I think it's clear that Americans very much want to make illegal immigration harder and legal immigration easier. And I think the bill is a first step towards getting to a position where we can actually have increased legal immigration. And to that point, and to tie this also into US-India relations, I think having increased high-skilled legal immigration would be incredibly beneficial. Jay Shankar in a previous talk earlier this summer said that the creation of the H-1B visa and the Indian use of it changed U.S.-India relations as much as the end of the Cold War, which I don't think is necessarily an inaccurate statement to make, but it's really something that obviously has massive ramifications for U.S. foreign policy as well as U.S. economic policy. And one of the things that we would like to see that we've championed consistently is recapturing green cards. Right now, as I'm sure you know, oftentimes Indian nationals are the ones who are most hurt by the per country cap on employment-based green cards. So by a arcane and, to be quite frank, entirely self-inflicted and unnecessary provision in immigration law in the United States, only 7% of employment-based green cards can go to any one nationality. Obviously, India has many high-skilled workers who are here in the U.S., so this causes many problems down the line as far as residency goes, as far as creating accidentally, essentially an undocumented population of Indian children who age out of their parents' green cards if they're not able to get them in time. We have, through administrative errors, left hundreds of thousands of green cards unused over the years. And there's legislation now that, if it were passed, would allow us to recapture over 400,000 green cards that could be used. Obviously, not all of those would go towards Indian nationals. It certainly wouldn't solve the massive backlog in green cards for Indian nationals. But that's just one example of how some reform that I think would be common sense could be accepted by both parties once border security is actually firmly dealt with, would not only help the United States more broadly, but also help Indian nationals here in the United States and U.S.-India relations more broadly.
Just to add on to that, speaking more about the legal migration pathways, the country cap has caused or led to excessive amount of wait time for Indian migrants, especially those who come through employment-based visas, up to over 100 years for some visa categories before they can get green card or any sense of geographical stability in this country. And it's these stories and these figures that can sometimes create a sense of hopeless or lack of hope among people who are in India, that if they do come to the United States through legal pathways, they may not ever get geographical stability, or they may not ever be able to get that green card or get any sense of like permanent residency in the United States. Of course, adding on to the fact that some of them may not have the same level of skills or education to be able to get into a workplace or schools in the United States. But just to add on to what Gil said about legal migration pathways, like specific examples or specific policy recommendations, we also at the Niskanen Center talked about how the STEM OPT program does not currently include medical graduates. So people who are immigrants or who are not who are like on F1 visa and go into medical school in the United States currently cannot get STEM OPT, or they are not under the STEM OPT program. And that can also create some issues, because if you graduate from a university in the United States with a medical degree, but you are not able to utilize the STEM OPT program, which would allow you to stay for 24 additional months to, sort of prove your competency and potentially, let employer sponsor you on a more permanent basis, you have to go back to your country. And it's these kind of policies that sometimes might hinder people in India who, want to take legal pathways but are not able to because they don't see a future after they take that legal pathway. And currently, 1 in 5 immigrant doctors in the United States are from India or are Indian nationals or of Indian background. And what this goes on to show is that it's these policies that can possibly, if tackled, for example, by including medical degrees in STEM OPT program, can contribute to more legal pathways, which could potentially deter people from, instead of coming through irregular channels, coming through these legal pathways.
My guests on the show this week are Gil Gera and Sneha Puri. They are scholars at the Niskanen Center and authors of the brand new analysis, Indian Migrants at the U.S. Border, What the Data Reveals. Gil, Sneha, I want to thank you so much for coming. This is really illuminating, I think, an issue that has puzzled a lot of people who follow India and the U.S.-India relationship. Thanks for bringing much-needed light onto the subject, and nice to talk to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grant Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.